Brilliant. Enjoyed that. I just wanted to bring everything together really because I'm a member of the contemporary British painting, and I became a committee member this year, and I've been with the guild for a few years, but Paul and Julian joined this year, and Juliet's been there for a while, so I just decided it'd be really lovely to bring painters together in both organizations to talk about our painting practices in terms of Ruskin. So we also have Judith Tucker, who's the new chair of contemporary British painting as well. So I thought it was a really nice kind of open communication between the two organizations. So as time is short, we're going to go through, we're roughly each going to talk at about 10 minutes. We've all learned to talk really fast and move through slides really fast. So I'm going to start with my screen share. Hopefully it will be successful, and Judith is going to follow me. So here I am. Brilliant. So I'm Joanna Whittle. I'm a painter, a landscape painter. I also make ceramic objects, and I also I work in a collective called the Heavy Water Collective, who engages with archives. So I'm going to set my timer because that's important, or I'm going to try to stay to time. So really I'm looking at, I decided to really select one kind of element of Ruskin, because really with Ruskin there's such a huge body of work and such a huge influence. So I'm really focusing on the seven lamps of architecture, simply because in my practice the ruin repeats and repeats, and has done since I started landscape painting in 2000. And in Ruskin there's this real weight of rock. You know, I think rock is spoken about throughout these talks this evening, which is interesting. But there's the weight of the ruin, the heaviness of rocks and monuments being built up and decaying through time, and being this record of, you know, our ancestors and our time on Earth. Ruins have been a part of my life for a long time. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and you would find these structures in the desert, these kind of, you know, there's an older ruin in Taif in the mountains, but also just in the desert, you'd find these kind of half-built foundations, you know, almost ruins to the future of homes that were never inhabited and retaken by the desert. And there's something really interesting in, you know, I only really considered it in the last few years that in all of my landscape painting, there seems to be one structure in space, and really that's how you encounter things in the desert, these isolated structures. The image on the right is my family's ruin, which they don't own, but it's where my mum grew up in Ireland. And I go, whenever we go back to Ireland, I visit, and it's really interesting to see this active ruin, and also which is contained within my lifetime, my family's lifetime. But also this idea with Ruskin where the home becomes monument. So it's not just municipal civic buildings, or, you know, maybe these romantic things. It's also a romanticization of home and the values of home, and then becoming ruined. So when I started painting landscape, I was, you know, really looking for the contemporary ruin, looking for ways to kind of think of those kind of bigger romantic things, but things that were contemporarily decaying, contemporaneously decaying. And I started making these very large scale works, these big open spaces, nearly up to 2 meters in scale, and thinking about the viewer inhabiting them. But when I had a break from painting, and when I came back to it, I moved to this very miniature scale, and there's something subversive in the miniature, and you know, Ruskin refers to it, it's kind of dishonesty and this kind of hidden deceit, which I find really interesting. And a lot of the time when I'm thinking of Ruskin, I'm thinking of these kind of pure values he had, and how my work's constantly subverting that, but it's this underpinning which is really interesting that it's there. And thinking of Gaston Bachelard's intimate immensity, you know, this immensity found in the tiny, in the imagination. So in my time when I wasn't painting, I did a variety of different things, but one of the interesting thing I did was working in an English heritage building in a Scheduled H monument. So I was a Scheduled H monument. So there was a lot of military history in this nature reserve of different layers from different time periods. And I'm really interested in these as ruins because of their complete functionality, the rapidity of their building, you know, the building on the left-hand side is actually called the right battery, which is a gun emplacement, and it was created by throwing up a piece of corrugated iron and shoving cement against it. So this complete functionality, and also there's coastal artillery searchlight building, and this kind of oblique future they would have, you know, discovered as ruins, what would they mean? But also the kind of immensity of what they signify, you know, with these traumas of war. There's something about the monument in all of, you know, once you take an empty space and put one building in it, it becomes monumental, whatever it is. And I've spent a lot of my time sketching water towers. They're a repeated theme. So I have hundreds of these, and this is this idea of monument in absence, this kind of looming presence, which I think the ruin does through its temporality as well, this kind of constant signifier of time past and passing. And there's something interesting in Ruskin, that this really interesting idea that, you know, a building achieves perfection by becoming a monument, by becoming memorial. Only through its, you know, its build up and decline does it attain this perfection, this kind of romantic perfection of crumbling, and it's the signifier of time. So this was painting I did in 2017, but I rehung it again at a solo exhibition at the Whitaker Museum. I hung it with some of these memorial ribbons of gravestone based on kind of early 20th century memorial ribbons. And I think there's a really nice contrast between the ephemerality and the weight of stone. Again, this repeated weight of stone. So in 2017, I mean, that previous painting was the last painting I really did with, as I say, laying down brick. And I started to move to these temporary structures and consider what could happen to the ruin when it was put through this process, but being temporary, being fragile, being something that moves, that doesn't stay in that same place. And this idea of subversion in Ruskin, you know, this quote on the left about these buildings being thrown up, concretions of lime and clay which spring up from the needed fields. And really that was about these kind of suburbs expanding from cities and desecrating the countryside, but kind of placed onto this idea of temporariness. Is a really interesting idea of honesty and integrity being considered in brick, and a deceitfulness in temporariness, but also the privilege of being able to remain in your country where you can see your history move, where you can see your ancestors through stone, because that really feels a privilege now when so many people are displaced and either can't return to their countries to see this, or there's buildings that are no longer there because they're destroyed by war. So it's this kind of difference, you know, a privilege of being static. And there's a fluidity in my work. There's a fluidity between landscape and structure, where the landscape undermines and becomes motile and flooded. And then there's this idea that they lay down stones. I can't see it because all our heads in the way, but I'll move us. You know, that there would be blank stones, should be left in places to be inscribed with the summary of his life. And I think that's really interesting, these blank stones where you wait for the future. It's almost like Ruskin is always waiting for this future ruin. But I thought it was interesting, you know, bringing this to these fragile habitations. And this was one I did in lockdown. And I was thinking about memorial and monument, again with temporariness and this slumping, sagging, decaying structure, but it's flourishing with the ritual of mourning, so that the ruin and the kind of ruinous becomes brought to life by human activity. And then I started making these forest shrines. Again, just after lockdown, after the winter lockdown, so January 2021, and thinking about this ritual and these accumulation. So again, it's the converse with Ruskin of these big rock edifices eroding through time, becoming beautiful through time. Rather, these structures build up and become enmeshed with time. They become part of the forest rather than declining within the forest. It's almost like they're absorbed by it. So I show these pieces I paint them on really ephemeral surfaces often, so that the architecture becomes undermined by ephemerality, and juxtaposing them with these brick edifices and repeating that in these installations, repeating the ephemerality of our presence, I suppose. two more slides. There's again something interesting in Ruskin with this idea of decoration and another level of dishonesty. So there's this purity in pale blank, the pale blank purity of stone, and anything which decorates it like paint and artifice, you know, makes a deceit of it and a lie of it. And I'm really interested in fairground architecture. I've just done a big project with the National Fairground and Circus Archive, and it's these kind of it's all about deceit and artifice and fragile structures creating new worlds and telling you these lies to exist in. And I'm really interested in that in architecture, and these little vignettes that are often in their design, which are really similar or reminiscent of those Turner vignettes that Ruskin was so in love with, really. And then this is repeated in this little miniature, which is, you know, about 10 centimeters. And again, this idea that Ruskin talks about of tracery of the carving, in which, again, there's a deceit once it transcends too much from stone and too much into ornament, where it's kind of a lie, you know, it's dishonest. And I think I always play with that in my work. You know, there's this romantic idea of the ruin becoming overgrown and nature takes it back. But I think in my work, it kind of pushes it a bit further, where stone becomes foliage and foliage becomes stone. They become interchangeable, and it's really hard to define which is which. So it's almost like they become the same thing. And just this final slide, I'm keeping very well to time. You know, the final idea, this idea of witness that Ruskin talks about, the building as witness, the ruin as witness. And through my forest shrine work, and this idea of ritual and memorial, it's kind of bringing nature back as the witness, you know, and this kind of timelessness of nature, this constant absorption into nature of gas, and our lives and our carbon cycle. So actually bringing that witness back into ephemerality. And this woman who repeats as a motif in my work as this kind of witness. I took her from a photograph of from a First World War magazine, this strange figure which appears, and I brought her out and made her appear in other work. So yes, I think that that kind of brings it full circle from stone to leaf, really. And that's where my work exists, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass on to Judith Tucker as the CVP representative, and let her talk about her work.
Thank you so much, Jo, for first that wonderful talk, and thank you for setting this really interesting panel up, and thank you very much to the Guild of St George for allowing me as a non-member to join you. I'm very pleased to be here. I work with landscape pretty much all of my creative life, and I've had the figure of Ruskin as a kind of ghost through my career, and particularly in my education career. I was at the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford many years ago, and I found the degree show cover from all those years ago with a very sepulchral image of Ruskin there. And although, of course, it was an indirect education, the emphasis on drawing at that time was very, very strong. But then several years later, when I did a PhD, I did it in Leeds, but my supervisor was actually one of the companions of the Guild, and his love and passion for geology and a way of viewing landscape as a son of a miner, but also a mineral collector, and then the way he was able to bring that into his art practice profoundly influenced the way I thought. And then a third little vignette, if you like, about Ruskin and me was going to see this show, which was both in Sheffield and at the Two Temple Place in London, and seeing this extraordinary study of moss, which I'm going to return to at the end of the talk. So what I've decided to do today is talk to you a little bit about my most recent project, Hideaway, Painting and Poetry from the Saltmarsh, which is an interdisciplinary project involving painting and poetry, informed by community engagement, collaboration with wildlife and nature conservation professionals, and archival research in relation to environmental and social change. And this was undertaken in collaboration with the radical landscape poet, Harriet Harlow. And painting and poetry is something that's going to be featuring later on in other people's talks. So this project, which involved looking very closely at vernacular architecture in relation to saltmarsh plants, chimed so well with some of Ruskin's concerns. Both this plotland community, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and the plant community there are vulnerable. And exploring this relation of the legacy and heritage of plotland architecture and seeing that in relation to the ecology of the area resonates with Ruskin's dual interests in the protection of historic buildings and the conservation of natural landscapes. So this project is based in the Humberston Fitties, which some of you may well know. It's one of the UK's last remaining plotlands near the seaside town of Cleethorpes, far from the mountainous landscape so beloved of Ruskin. But it is where the working people of Sheffield used to go on their holidays. And they've been staying there since the Industrial Revolution. The Fitties is a quirky domestication of land that, like much of the low-lying land around the mouth of the Humber Estuary, is carved out of saltmarsh. The word Fitties itself means saltmarsh, and the often self-built chalets, houses and sheds of the Fitties lie low behind marshy beach and dunes, always liable to flood to return to their former state. Here, since between the wars, local people and visitors have erected their diverse dwellings with individualistic names and styles in order to enjoy the simple restorative pleasures of seaside life. Now, this exhibition was in the Millennium Galleries in Sheffield, right next door to Ruskin's objects. So that again brought the geology and paint into play. This Arcadia for all, to coin the anarchist historian Colin Ward and Dennis Hardy's phrase pertaining to plotlands, more than resonates with Ruskin's ideas that beauty in art or design could not be achieved among people who'd never had the chance to experience natural beauty. So this interwar plotland movement offered working people precisely this chance. And I just wanted to say that I've been working on the coast for, again, nearly all my creative life. And I'm interested, as Joe is, in that tension between somewhere that is a very significant military importance and also is a place where people go to enjoy themselves. So this tension between trauma and pleasure is something that I really try to get into my paintings. For our most recent project, we brought together work to do with the chalets and our environmental interests in the area. Alan Dowling, who is a local historian who we met actually shortly before he died in 2018, left an archive of historic materials related to the Fitties in the Grimsby Archive, which we were able to explore in a creative context, both for the human material and the record of changes in environment and ecology. And although many visitors to and inhabitants of the Fitties are conscious of their own vulnerability to sea level rise, they are often unaware that how much the saltmarsh can protect land from flooding. So I'm also really interested in having conversations with the long history of landscape painting, as well as being in dialogue with contemporary places. And some of you will notice that I've deliberately reused some picturesque motifs and compositions in my work. And I challenge myself to work both with and against notions and conventions of the romantic, of the picturesque, and counteract ideas of the view. So in one painting, I'll work with a view, and in the other one, I'll be sort of inside the landscape looking out. What we felt also in the exhibition, by placing together text and image, we have a greater chance of avoiding the landscape cliches of a bleak sublime invited by both marshland and the picturesque. We're going to be hearing more from Julian Perry about painting, erosion and climate change, but another artist who works with similar themes is the filmmaker Esther Johnson, who also works at Sheffield Hallam, and her two films, Hinterland from 2002 and Retreating the Line from 2017, concern the loss of land and destruction of homes through erosion around Skipsea and Holderness in East Yorkshire. So these two films employ many of the same motifs that I'm interested in: the teetering chalets and caravans perched on the edges of cliffs, images of cut-off roads at the base of cliffs, and the trope of weathered fragments. So for so many artists, including some here today on the panel, chalets, caravans and perilous residences on the edge have become places of Anthropocenic contemplation, perhaps even a kind of leitmotif of the Anthropocene. But if we're talking about painterly technique, it's through painting and drawing that I turn what might be a comfortable image of a holiday home or humble saltmarsh plant into an unfamiliar and uncertain place. So, as we've heard from Jo, we know that memory, memorial and place are deeply entwined in Ruskin's thinking. And we'll be hearing more from other artists later of the legacies of Ruskin's ideas on ruins, the ways in which the natural and cultural become entwined in these, which is a kind of precursor to what Donna Haraway has termed, in one word, nature culture. And whilst most of the chalets now are not ruins, these, by the way, are imaginary paintings that I've developed using the archival photographs, but then some of my experiences through walking through the chalets now. They do bear what Ruskin might have thought of as elements, quotation, of a certain past as a fleshly stain of time or wound on a decaying building. And my painting practice is deeply engaged with memory and explores both how we might be inhabited, not only by our own histories, memories and experiences, but also by those of others, and the ways in which places too bear traces of others, both visible and invisible. And what I really like to think of my paintings and drawings as sort of new places between the psychic traces and the actual places in the landscapes. So these paintings developed out of processes of layering and meshing. They focus a lot on surface, yet they also evolve out of the viscosity and liquidity of the paint. Now that description sounds really like the saltmarsh itself. So what of this larger landscape where these chalets are situated? What we really wanted to counteract in this project was that sense of vulnerability and helplessness in which both landscape and people are perceived as potential victims. And we wanted to mitigate that in order to avoid paralysis. And in practical terms, the restoration of saltmarsh has the potential to help protect land from flooding. But let's very briefly take a quick look at this painting, Dark Marsh, Silver Marsh. They're quite large scale, and the painting, I like to think, is sumptuous, uncanny, but also curiously precise in a way that I hope Ruskin might have appreciated all at the same time. But this precision is both more and less than traditional botanic or scientific illustration, where plants by necessity are often considered as specimens. Although recent layouts like the one on the right of the field guide belies this slightly. The painting is precise on one hand, but it's also shifting and uncertain. The painted plants crisscross and weave across the surface. Each stem, petal or dried pappus is given equal weight and as importance as the other. The rich, murky, sandy water out of which they grow is considered in relation as important as the plants, perhaps pointing to the importance of ecological interconnectedness. Again, the inclusion in this painting of water seeks to imply this and also hint at, rather than be over didactic about, the impact of environmental change or biodiversity, reminding the viewer that while the saltmarsh plants protect, they themselves are vulnerable to sea level rise. So this is another one of the series. So we can kind of see here that this is the painting's apparent beauty belies darker and melancholic attributes. So we've got the long art history of plants as a symptom of loss, perhaps a contemporary take on the traditional idea of memento mori. So The focus is on the fragility of the more than human life, specifically the endangered nature of plant species. It's not a new thing, but it's a reinterpretation of the tradition of the memento mori or vanitas, paintings which reflect material decay and the futility of worldly human life. Using flowers as a metaphor and symbol, of course, is commonplace. You can see that I draw on some of the traditions, images of sharply lit flowers on a dark background, of course, but mine are not cut flowers arranged in a vase. And in these paintings, although through scale and viewpoint, I attempt to address the plant as an equal. The scale of that pappus is the size of a human head, to redress the anthropocentric view. Plants are not only a metaphor, we acknowledge that these plants are key for our planet. We encounter these painted plants in an immersive way, so challenging the traditional landscape views that I've used in the previous series. I'm nearly at the end, but I wanted just to also acknowledge that I'm working here with other traditions that are, perhaps which are interested, so that the darker background relates to the Mille Fleurs tapestry tradition, and issues of gender arise here, as these were mostly made by women and flower painting became somewhat gendered and the preserve of the amateur. But even Marianne North here, the pioneering botanical artist, challenged the tradition of botanical flower painting and chose to paint the plants in their natural settings. So why might painting and making poetry about plants matter now? And how might a deep exploration of plants, the kind of way of looking that I imagine that Ruskin would have had to do when he was making his own closely observed work, what does it mean to understand a locale like the salt marsh through an intense study of what's growing close at hand? Well, we can, of course, there's a provocation to slow down and give attention to detail. And I think my paintings and poems operate somewhere between these two paintings, between close observation like Dürer and lyricism like the Peinecker painting from the Dulwich Picture Gallery of this incredible blue plant, which is actually, of course, to do with fugitive colour. So my paintings play with scale and hence value. The plants are defamiliarized, and I'm just going to put the last slide of Ruskin, because I want to leave you with this wonderful Ruskin study, which I think has seeped into my unconsciousness and is as resonant now as it was when he did it. I just need to find out, make sure I can unshare my screen. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to now move alphabetically. So we're going to start with Paul Evans next, who's a Sheffield member of the Guild of St George.
Thanks so much, Jo. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to join you this evening and to talk about my work in such frankly illustrious company. Yeah, thanks to your talks as well, Jo and Judith. They're tremendous, very, very interesting. And thanks to the Guild for again also for giving me this opportunity. It's much appreciated. Okay, so I'm Paul Evans, and I've got a pretty varied creative practice, to tell the truth. I work with a number of media and creative strategies, from charcoal drawings to virtual reality. At root, there's a deep love of the environment and nature that I hope Ruskin would have approved of. I also work in socially engaged contexts with the aim to create positive change. Again, I hope Ruskin would have approved. But I always come back to landscape and landscape painting. I have a very personal, intimate relationship with the genre that I hope I'll be able to go some way towards explaining this evening. My talk will take the form of a journey in 3 parts, which I've kind of broadly titled Why I Paint Landscapes, The 7 Wonders, and Lost and Found Edges. I won't claim to be a Ruskin scholar, but I have brought a few words from Ruskin's Lectures on Landscape, written in 1877, to accompany us on these wanderings. I'll begin with a confession. For many years, I was unconvinced about what I might be able to contribute to landscape painting, to be honest. This might be surprising considering how much I love landscape, and I use the word love advisedly. Our relationship has been deeply emotional for decades. As Ruskin says in his lectures on landscape, I might take some comfort from this, that you must like the landscape that you're going to draw better than you like your drawing of it, however well it may succeed. If you would not rather have the real thing than your sketch of it, you're not in the right state of mind for sketching at all. I live in Sheffield, where I have a studio at Yorkshire Art Space, and I moved here in 1980, ostensibly to study philosophy, but really it was the rock that drew me, the unique and beautiful landscapes defined by the edges of gritstone that lie to the west and southwest. As a walker and rock climber, I spent a lot of time in the Peak District, moving in and through it on what physicists might call a variety of length scales, from a few aesthetically absorbing moves on a boulder just a few metres in height, to a long day spent roaming the Edale skyline around Rushope Edge, Kinder Scouts, Wing Hill, Lewes Hill and Mantor. I must admit I'm particularly enamoured of these place names which echo their origins in Brythonic languages. This embodied experience and knowledge of place has imparted a particular feeling for texture. Climbing is a highly tactile activity that gives a person a special understanding of the nature of stone. We've been referring to stone, Joe referred to stone earlier. I think it's an important element. I mean, you know, we stand on it all the time, but to understand it through climbing, I think in a way it's a kind of translation into movement, the movement of rhythms created by the abrasive weather world, a kind of dance with geology, with deep time, and the natural forces that brought these rocks into being. During these climbs and explorations, my eyes kept switching like a camera from panorama mode into macro, zooming out onto the peaks and moorlands, and then focusing in with fascination on the weathered smoothness of a hold, on tiny shards of mica, glinting low-angled winter light. Encapsulating all this experience, distilling all the details and feelings available to my hands, my body and my eyes onto a small piece of board or canvas seemed like an overwhelming task. A recent walk along Ashop Edge on Kinder Scout reminded me of this difficulty. Surrounded by such a complexity of texture, colour and terrain, and not really knowing which way to look, where to focus, I fell into a kind of hallucinogenic reverie or delirium shaped by the shifting passage of light. As Rob Hindle puts it in his poem Kinder Scout, which features a part of the Seven Wonders, which we'll come to soon, the wind makes faces in the grit stacks, totems and gargoyles squint and grimace. The air here is half water, mouths suck and gape in the rock. Bristlegrass, brown, bone pale, shudders like hide, grips each edge and cleft. This is landscape coming into being. But I might take a more modest approach. As Ruskin says in his lectures on landscape, if I only could get some shadow or scrawl of this to carry away with me, how glad I would be. Sometimes it helps to concentrate, to get your bearings, to focus in on a small spot. Here's a small painting that might suggest a glimpse into a black moorland pool, perhaps a quartz pebble visible beneath the surface. It might also suggest a view through a microscope or a telescope, something tiny and organic, or an ancient lost continent viewed from a distance. Entitled Paradise Lost, it's been made in oil paint and plastic. It's a modest painting with the ambitious intention of provoking thought about the world we live in and our potential future. It might also echo the environmental concerns expressed in so many rich and diverse ways this evening by the other artists and speakers. If we zoom out, we might envisage something like this. Here's a much larger painting entitled Landscape and Memory. Somehow it feels bigger than 1.5 meters square. And the title is taken from the extraordinary book by Simon Sharma. The force of gravity has played a strong role in this painting, which draws inspiration from the lines of drainage that rainwater might paint down the surface of a rock face. The Seven Wonders. Following 4 paintings are from the Seven Wonders series, a poetry and painting project that began in 2009 and was first exhibited in April 2010. During this time, I worked with Brian Lewis from Longbarrow Press, who curated the project, and 11 poets. I've been advised that 11 is a lot of names to list, but I think I need to do so as a note of thanks to James Carruth, Matthew Clegg, Angelina de Rosa, Mark Goodwin, Rob Hindle, Chris Jones, Helen Mort, Faye Musselwhite, Alistair Noon and Peter Riley. The Seven Wonders was an attempt to put a figure into the landscape without physically painting in the figure. Expressed in the form of poetry, this unseen figure might be a narrator or interpreter, an absent presence that might play a similar role, perhaps that referred to by Judith regarding Harriet's poetry, acting as a guide through a process that has been called ekphrasis, the description of painting as a literary device. As it worked out, the process was a lot less like guidance or interpretation, more like a dance between words and painting, both forms expressing a metered, rhythmical materiality. The title for the project came from a 17th century guidebook by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, originally in Latin, first published in English in 1676. De Mirabilibus Pecci, being the wonders of the peak in Derbyshire, commonly called the Devil's Art of the Peak. Hobbes recounted, of the high peak are 7 wonders writ, 2 fonts, 2 caves, 1 palace, mount and pit. It's fair to say that Daniel Defoe was unimpressed, calling these the wonderless wonders of a howling wilderness. Our project arose from a desire to redress a kind of imbalance that Robert Macfarlane writes about in The Wild Places. On almost every front, we have begun turning away from a felt relationship with the natural world. In so many ways, there has been a prizing away of life from place and abstraction of experience into different kinds of touchlessness. The Seven Wonders is our attempt to explore and celebrate our felt relationship with the natural world. Our list of 7 wonders has differed from that of Hobbes. We chose nothing man-made, no palace, and aimed to draw on more modern sensibilities, forms that evoke the rhythms and textures of nature, in particular geology, the weight of temporality, as Joe has described it. Firstly, Mam Tor by James Carruth, this painting here. The slow brutality of ice caught on a wind that, given time, will wet a body to an edge. High seat of abrasive gods, their stone altar scattered. A few evocative lines from Hen Cloud by Chris Jones. When snow mobs us halfway up Hen Cloud, so that rufous bracken flowers white, and feet I land in, other feet you leave, as if to make a tightrope of ourselves. This painting is accompanied by some poetry by Mark Goodwin, but Mark's a sound artist and he's got a particularly physical way with words that I can't do justice to. So I'd recommend that you visit the website and see the poem and properly experience his unique way of working with words and space. Phlegmatic, the poem by Faye Musselwhite, offers a very physical and very embodied juxtaposition with my painting In the Downfall. Here are a few lines. Here at the wet-lashed gape of this caged lung, she hears it bluster and fall, trickled whisper, the broad-throated roar, feels its spit brush her, stroke her clear. Okay, the last little stage of the ramble, lost and found edges. Okay. So this painting is perhaps the most successful of a series of paintings that I've made in response to my experiences of the gritstone edges of the Derbyshire Peak District. Entitled Kerber, it's from a painting poetry series that takes a notional walk through a number of seasons. These edges form a discontinuous broken line from Derwent to Chatsworth via Stanage and Birchams and various other beautiful places. I'm not a poet, but with the assistance of Mark Goodwin and Chris Jones, I have managed to write a series of haiku that I hope are tolerable expressions of the poem. The haiku that accompanies Kerber might best be read by sight rather than read out loud. I've used 2 mathematical symbols to evoke a sense of geometry. I'll just read it out. Hot aches and cold, hard geometry, Kerber's fissured logic. So perhaps this line of edges might bring our journey around in a circuit to the position I was in at the beginning of my talk, where I was troubled about what I might be able to contribute to landscape painting. My current project is to go back to these edges and see what happens when I walk back along them, see what I've lost and see what secrets I might find by close looking, focusing and scanning the horizon. I'll leave the final word to Ruskin. Nature is always mysterious and secret in her use of means. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was lovely. And I'm going to move swiftly on to Juliet, please.
Thank you. I can work this out. Right. Okay. So I hope everyone can see that. So my work shares a few commonalities with all of those that we've just discussed, and I'm going to touch on a few different themes that I think resonate with my work and Ruskin's writing. One of them being ruins, and modern ruins have been a subject matter in my work since my undergraduate degree. The kinds of sites I'm drawn to are temporary and often in the process of decaying or collapsing. They're described by the theorist Tim Edensor as modern ruins. Such sites are in between a state of abandonment and potential redevelopment, and are in a constant state of flux. So for reference, these two photos are images of my former studio, or where my former studio was situated, on a place called Plat Ayot, which is an island in the Thames near Hampton. And it is a semi-derelict, or was rather a semi-derelict boatyard. And the people that owned it were constantly trying to get permission to redevelop it, and it never happened. And unfortunately, there was a mysterious fire, and it no longer exists in this form. So that is an example of what Tim Edensor would classify as a modern ruin, something that's never the same twice when you visit it. So for Ruskin, there was an ability about ruins. The stains of time and building ruins were crucial eyewitnesses to demonstrate aging in architecture. Ruins were truthful material records of passing time. He did not believe in material restoration. In The Lamp of Memory, Ruskin introduces us to the idea of trusteeship. It is again no question of expediency or feeling whether we shall preserve the buildings of past times or not. We have no right whatsoever to touch them. They are not ours. They belong partly to those who built them, and partly to all the generations of mankind who are to follow us, he wrote. Like Ruskin, I'm interested in tracing and speculating on the past lives of buildings. Ruskin believed that buildings should be conceived of as not only for current use, but on the assumption that they should last forever, to be appreciated by future generations. This seems at odds with the notion of modern ruins, which are not deemed worthy of preservation. Rather, they are characterised by their transience and ephemerality. During my undergraduate degree, I decided to record through drawing the development of Canary Wharf, and that's what you can see in this drawing here. Having made a number of excursions, I produced a series of detailed drawings of different views of the boatyards on the opposite side of the river to the financial centre. In doing so, I wanted to echo the activities of the 19th century journeyman artists who would produce topographical drawings of the sites to which they travelled. Ruskin only allowed restoration processes based mainly on the work of illustration and writings, on a process of recording the ruins, not on rebuilding them materially. This was echoed in my activity of recording these sites, which were in a continual state of transformation and which no longer exist in any recognisable form. All of the areas I was depicting were subsequently developed for the Olympics. So you wouldn't be able to find anything remotely resembling this anymore. So I'm kind of glad that I did record them when I did, although I had no idea at the time that this was going to happen. Over a number of years, I increased the scale and complexity of my drawings and paintings. The drawing process itself involves a number of stages. The image is built up from several successive layers of watercolour, ink and resist, the latter being used to mask off tonal washes. Working across the composition as a whole, all areas of a similar light tone are masked off using a photograph for reference. Subsequent layers of ink and resist are added until the darkest tonal areas are achieved. The duration of this process itself adds to the notion that the drawings act as a form of preservation for the sites depicted. Their sometimes monumental scale subverts the idea that watercolour is to be used as a sketching medium in the field and occupies an inferior position on the historical hierarchy of media that was taught in the academies. Through an emphasis on mark making, I seek to reflect the surfaces of the areas drawn, proposing my own vocabulary of marks in order to suggest features within that landscape and to investigate the extent to which negative marks and raw paper can constitute a readable representational image. Importantly, this drawing method is proposed as a means for representing the fragility and impermanence of contemporary sites of ruination. This emphasis on tonality through layered mark making has something in common with Ruskin's meticulous attention to detail, achieved through the fragmented application of watercolour. For Ruskin, ruins mediate between nature and culture. In The Lamp of Truth, he claims that there is not a cluster of weeds growing in any cranny of ruin which has not a beauty in all respects nearly equal and in some immeasurably superior to that of the most elaborate sculpture of its stones. The decay of a building was an inevitability that preservation rather than conservation could delay rather than prevent. The colonisation of a ruin by nature was both the cause and consequence of its decline and something to be celebrated. Ruskin's detailed observations of ruins indulged his passions for nature and architecture. Ruins fulfilled a longing for a past in which human activity and natural activity were in step, a time removed from the rapid pace of the Industrial Revolution. As previously mentioned, modern ruins are often not allowed to persist for a sufficient time for nature to fully colonise them. Constructing paper models, such as these shown, inspired by toy theatres or paper peep shows, has enabled me to present an imaginative reinterpretation of the original sites I visit. Their layered structure enables me to represent multiple views of the same site at different stages of the ruination process. Through imagination, I exaggerate the process of collapse and ruination, projecting a potential future onto sites that are, in reality, at an earlier stage of ruination. At the same time, this allows me to indulge my own love of natural forms, giving these equal, if not superior, weight in the composition to man-made structures, a state which is rarely observable in reality. These models are subsequently used as maquettes for drawings, paintings, and large-scale installations. Adopting the format of these layered models has enabled me to expand two-dimensional drawings and paintings into space. This has enabled me to create drawn and painted spaces that are capable of being physically entered by the viewer. Through this process, I intended to explore the possibilities of physically immersing the viewer in representational imagery, thereby enabling them to experience the sensation of being inside these fragile and mutable spaces, importantly, spaces they may never be able to experience in reality. In other instances, the maquette has been reinterpreted as a two-dimensional image, allowing me to experiment with scale and positioning within the composition to exaggerate aspects of ruination. Here, the maquette has been positioned within a wider ruined environment, in this case, one which is flooded. The notion of flooding is something that has dominated my work increasingly over the past few years. Ruins have moved from becoming partially submerged in water to being fully engulfed by it. Recent works depict the ruined landscape as though contained within tanks underwater, like experiments for capturing disintegration in stasis. This underwater world harks back to the ancient superstitions of waterways as places into which offerings would be cast. In these paintings, I imagine our contemporary world as just such another offering, lost to the rivers of time, a relic below the waterline. This change in my work acknowledges the transience not only of modern ruins, but of modern civilization, recognising the danger posed by climate change, something that Ruskin noted, although did not, of course, articulate in these terms. Ruskin noticed that the alpine glaciers appeared to be receding. The facades of his favourite buildings were slowly eroding away, and the air outside his window had become thick with dark, impenetrable smoke. The plague cloud that menaced him looked partly, according to him, as if it were made of poisonous smoke. There are at least 200 furnace chimneys in a square of 2 miles on either side of me, but mere smoke would not blow to and fro in that wild way. It looks more to me as if it were made of dead men's souls, such of them as are not yet gone where they have to go, and may be flitting hither and thither, doubting themselves of the fittest place for them. Whilst his views were derided at the time, his fears were prescient of the current existential threat that we face. And that is me.
Thank you so much, Juliet. That was wonderful. And we have one final speaker, last but not least, Julian Perry.
Thank you, Juliet. It was intimidating enough hanging next to you in Huddersfield, but now I'm speaking after all your wonderful pictures. Anyway, I am an artist preoccupied with mankind's complex relationship with the landscape. I have made exhibition projects on issues including historic tree management, that means sort of pollarding and coppicing, brownfield sites, some of which went on to become the 2012 Olympic Park, nature reserves, and most recently coastal erosion. My studio and home is in East London, and I work in oil paint on panels. My paintings develop from studies made plein air before the subjects. Ruskin preached the value of a healthy, interconnected relationship between nature, art, and society. This is a sentiment that I totally endorse and is at the core of my interest in Ruskin and the Guild. Ruskin's significance for me is as someone who saw no distinction between the best art and a hope for a better society. This political ambition is very attractive to me. He saw the craft tradition as a viable counter to the iniquitous Victorian industrial machine and the social and environmental chaos this was causing. Also, Ruskin was not only a critic, but also a skilled artist. His watercolor studies of architectural details, of fungi, minerals, kingfishers, etc., are wonderful and as good as any of his generation. This facility is a meeting of acute observation and honed skills, and in my experience, being an art critic is a lot easier than being an artist. But Ruskin was an artist and critic, and for me, this gives his utterances a greater credibility. Bizarrely, for my generation of artists, respect for technique was not taken for granted when I was a student, and was even considered suspect. Modernism preached it was the why you were doing something that needed to be discussed endlessly and developed, and that the how would naturally follow, a sentiment that has, however understandable, has resulted in some of the dullest exhibitions imaginable. As I have said, Ruskin preached the value of a healthy, interconnected relationship of nature, art, and society. I'd like to think all three meet in this painting of mine. Unlike my colleagues, I'm going to talk about just one work. It is an oil painting on 4 panels. It's called An Altarpiece to the Assumption of CO2, painted between 2019 and 2022. It is a large work. It is 2.5 meters tall by 3 meters wide. This work was the centerpiece for my 2022 show, There Rolls the Deep, at Southampton City Art Gallery, inspired by Matthias Grunwald's Isenheim altarpiece, which is approximately the same size. This large 4-panel work is intended to echo an early Renaissance altarpiece, pre-Raphaelite, if you like. But ironically, it is entirely secular in form. I am a devout atheist, but I want to usurp the drama, violence, and theatre of a Renaissance altarpiece. The object was to create a meditation on coastal erosion as an expression of rising sea levels and of weather weirding, reflecting the tragedy of climate breakdown and the incredible situation that we all find ourselves in. The left-hand panel, subtitled Hubris, is a scene at Haysborough, Norfolk, where erosion is taking between 2 and 10 meters of the coast per year. The broken revetments, that's the wooden structures in the background, conveniently echo the 3 crosses at Golgotha. They even include nails. And I'm going to just zoom in and show you the nails. There we go. They stand witness to previous but now failing attempts to slow erosion. The beach resembles a battlefield scattered with remains of previous failed attempts to slow erosion. It was whilst working on this panel that the cultural geographer David Matlas, who was helping me on the project, told me that this was the exact location of the Haysborough footprints. I haven't time here to talk more fully about these fascinating traces, but to summarize, these are footprints of possibly a family group wandering on estuarine foreshore, probably gathering shellfish, some 850 to 950,000 years ago. This extraordinary glimpse into deep time echo the 19th century's discoveries made of the Earth's great age. This precipitated the so-called crisis of faith, encapsulated 10 years later in Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, and addressed by the painter William Dyce in his wonderful painting Pegwell Bay of 1858. 3 interesting coastal references there. There's potential for a doctoral thesis, I think, but anyway. Ruskin himself had his own crisis of faith around the late 1850s. As a result of all of the above, I had to repaint the foreground to include hints of the footprints. I'm now going to show you the hints of footprints. There we go. I didn't want to make them too pronounced because the real things were quite subtle. And there is an extraordinary story as to how they were observed by some very observant person one morning walking their dog after a storm. But as I say, I haven't got time to talk any more about that, but well worth a Google if you don't know about the Haysborough footprints. The central panel, subtitled Loss, is an inverted tree at Cove Hythe in Suffolk. The tree has toppled forward and inverted and is now standing leaning against the cliffs that it has recently fallen from. In this context, it represents the Corpus Christi of Christian iconography. For me, it represents the absurdity of our situation where the natural world is turned upside down. Along this length of coast, as well as the trees, there are building materials, bricks and etc., bits of old ceramic pipe, etc., deposited by longshore drift. And I've depicted these in the base of the painting. An art critic has suggested that these look a little bit like dice, which would have been rather more sophisticated iconographic reference. I was merely going for the traditional skull. I'll show you what we've got down here. If I zoom in, there you can see a rather unusual, I think it's an air brick, but all these bits of building material are the remains of structures that have fallen off the cliffs further along. Oops. The right-hand panel, subtitled Vanity, is a dairy farm in East Yorkshire that is slowly sinking into the sea. The image is perhaps the most domestic, with the farm fridge freezers remaining as the dairy itself disintegrates. This is slightly different from general instances of coastal erosion where there is a catastrophic fall of sort of the cliffs. You can tell a location where erosion is active because the cliffs are vertical. In this instance, it was slightly different because they were actually just slumping, just sliding slowly down towards the sea. I rather like the apparent look of a blitzed building, the sort of, I particularly like the Second World War images of John Armstrong and Bomberg of destroyed buildings, and there's more than a sort of echo of those here. The moon echoes the panels of the Assumption of Christ in Grunewald's altarpiece, but more poignantly, The full moon references the spring tides that herald the most damage, a fact well known by the residents of eroding coastlines, and they dread the full moons that will probably wreak more harm. The lower panel, or predella, subtitled Death, is a dead tree on the beach at Bennica, Suffolk. All the other panels are landscapes. However, this is a construct echoing Holbein's Dead Christ of 1520, a wonderful, wonderful painting that, again, I strongly recommend you Google if you're not familiar with it. Perhaps one of the distinctive things about the figure is that his eyes are open, which is a rather shocking little detail. And this panel reflects the traditional entombment depicted at the base of a crucifixion. The whole four-panel work is a complex combination intended as a meditation on man-made rising sea levels as a harbinger of climate breakdown. A vital aspect of my work is precipitating discussion. For this exhibition, I led 20 guided tours of the show, and over 2,000 school children participated in workshops and talks. The images of a visitor who had not seen a trompe-l'oeil tree before, and she was utterly fascinated after having run at the length of the gallery to try and grab hold of it and being confounded by the fact it was a flat surface. She went and grabbed her mum's telephone in order to photograph it. And this little scene, it did mean we had to put a little wire around it, unfortunately, but this little scene was one of the highlights of the whole project. I hope that the various threads weaving through this work achieve the combination of society, nature, and art that Ruskin so promoted. Thank you very much. Right.
Thank you so much, all of you. It's been really brilliant, because even though I know your work quite well, I've learned so much about it still today. So they've been really generous and sort of quite moving talks as well about our place in the world too. So thank you so much, all of you. And Simon's going to field any questions, if there is any, with such succinct talks.
Yes, indeed. And I'd like to add my thanks. Absolutely fascinating and so beautifully complimentary, the five of you. There are no questions in the chat, but if anybody has a question or an observation they'd like to make, please feel free to unmute yourself. If you're willing for us to see who you are, turn your camera on. Do ask a question, make an observation. Anything you'd like to ask is enormously welcome. And there's also no obligation, of course, but please feel free. Helen, do you have a question?
I do. Please could Paul give us the website that he mentioned? I'm looking for the 7 Wonders and I keep getting Fleetwood Mac.
I'll put it in the chat, Helen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Should be, I'll just make sure I get it right.
In the meantime, I had a question, which is really, I suppose, to any of you. I was struck by the care you all take with matters of scale in terms of the work, and forgive the ignorance of the question, but I'm interested in a sense, when that comes to you, when it becomes clear what the scale of a piece or an impulse to make, when it becomes in relationship to what it is you're wanting to express. Do you, I mean, clearly before you start work on it, ideally you're going to have to know what size the thing is going to be, but where does that sit in relation to kind of the nature of the idea, and when does it become clear what the scale is going to need to be, given that you then start with a blank canvas or an empty space, whatever it might be? And I'd be interested in anybody's take on that, if that is an engaging question.
Well, I'll say something if you like. I cannot do a large picture unless I've done a small version of it that seems to work. And if I have a major space that's willing to show my work, and I feel strongly enough about the work that I'm doing, I want to make something that has a physical presence and is visible from the end of a 20-meter art gallery. Unfortunately, access to my studio is quite limited, so I have to make it in smaller parts in order to get it up and down the stairs. But scale is a pretty cliched but effective shortcut to making a powerful statement. It's also a shortcut to making an idiot of yourself if it doesn't work. But
okay,
I might have done that. I don't know.
I suppose for me, you know, there's the miniature. It kind of makes a certain pitch, and there's a certain certainty about brush mark and these finite, tiny little brushes. And the more you work into it, I suppose just practically on a large scale, you wouldn't be able to replicate that experience and that intensity. But I think, you know, from looking at listening to all of the talks today, there is a very conceptual element, you know, and a lot of my work refers to miniatures, miniatures of the past, and I use miniature techniques, you know, and the way Judy upscales, you know, these tiny vulnerable plants. So I think there's the, and again with Juliet and her use of watercolor in these huge monumental spaces. So I think there's a kind of instinctiveness at first, and then it becomes indented into your kind of your context of your practice, I think.
Thank you.
I say something. I think struck me, I was remembering something that a tutor at art school said once, which is that everybody's got a kind of natural comfortability with working at a certain scale. And so for me, I actually find it very difficult to work in miniature. You know, it doesn't suit the sort of the scale of the marks that I work with, I guess. And there's a certain scale at which they hold together and resonate exactly as I want them to. What I like to do within one painting is to sort of vary the scale of the marks as much as I possibly can. So, you know, you might have some where the leaves are kind of life size, and some where they're double life size, and some where they are quarter life size. But, you know, I find that I do agree with that statement that we all have a comfortable range within which we naturally work.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually very interesting. And I think for me, the hardest kind of paintings to make are the medium size. They're always a bit uneasy, where relatively small, I don't work in miniature, but I do work relatively small. And then I work fairly large, but not as, I mean, I'm not as large or as small as the other some of the other people on this panel, but I am also interested in never having something actually life size, so that it's always something uncanny, whether it's too small or too big, or it's something that you have to encounter that isn't quite right in terms of the, you know, so maybe the largest chalets are somehow 2/3 of the size or something like that. So, but I also think that I don't always know exactly what the meaning of the word. I've got an idea. I mean, Bridget Riley always said that artists have beginnings, not necessarily aims. And I think I feel like that. I have a beginning and I know what I'm doing up to a point, and then something might happen and the meaning might change. So then I have to think for the next painting. So
fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, just one more thing about that. I think with the circular ones, they're certainly referencing lenses, really. You know, kind of telescopes or microscopes. I think the square ones, they're kind of not really portraits, not really landscapes. So there's something ambiguous, I think, in that format. I used to make much bigger paintings that were about as big as me. I used to really enjoy making those, but it's become a little bit of a kind of practical issue in terms of space.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. Anyone else with a question question or anything they would like to add to our discussion. Indeed, if not, then any sort of closing reflections from the 5 speakers in terms of, I know you'd obviously, you know, met before and heard each other thinking about these things, but is there anything in, I suppose, in tribute to Mr. Ruskin, that sort of in a sense, hearing the blend of all 5 of you speak again, is there anything that strikes you as one of the 5 within that, that is a takeaway for you in terms of this discussion and this very generous sharing that you've all contributed to?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the Guild for letting us talk and letting us put this together. You know, it's been amazing, and I think it's that discourse, and I think all of us, you know, having this time to focus on our practice and how this relates to Ruskin, and to find that relevance, that ongoing relevance, and to remain in dialogue with it. You know, with my work, it's you know, it might be not opposing, but you know, these 2 sides of the same concept. And I think that the ability of Ruskin to transcend that, these themes and these underpinning themes, to transcend time, I think, and to be relevant, especially in terms of, you know, kind of both architecture and environment and nature, and all of these kind of enduring themes. And, you know, like having the time and spending the time to think about Ruskin again. And, you know, there is a real kind of beauty to the way he writes, which you know, it's really lovely to have been able to spend time with that and to focus on that for a short period.
Thank you. Well, I think rather perfectly, we should draw things to a close at this point. We've been going for about an hour and a quarter. And so can I add a final thank you on behalf of the Guild? Can I say how brave I think Paul was to be a contributor, given his name doesn't begin with J? It was a nearly universal panel of J's, but Paul, you've subverted that brilliantly. But thank you to all of you, really. It's you know, your talks may have been 10, 12 minutes, but there's many, many minutes and hours behind all of that. Indeed, the lifetime of your practice, which you've shared so generously. And it's wonderful to sort of kick off what we hope will be an increasing number of online events over the winter and into next spring that the Guild will host on a number of different topics and thoughts and ideas. So we're really grateful to you all for that. And thank you so much to those of you who joined us as audience. Do, if you've enjoyed it, and some of you have said very nice things in the chat, then do look out for the recording, which will be shared probably in the next few days. It will eventually be on our YouTube channel, on our website, and I'll share it on social media as well, so that other people have an opportunity to benefit from all that we've heard. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording